Mayfair was quiet this evening. An air of caution left a slight nibble, and Delvina was sat at the ivy. Between her fingers lay a thin cigarette, often seen smoked by Eastern Europeans in London. Her form was picturesque, yet this was true but every day. For those passers-by, she became just a memory, not a figment. Yet, to Delvina, this was every day. On her phone, as most well-to-do ladies enjoy so much these days, something was seen to trouble her. Her newsfeed was not for your average woman. No, her proclivities covered less the dogs, but more the dogs of society. By day, her time was spent flicking between case files. She was a girl with a brain, and she'd been told not to waste it. And blindly, she'd ran into the world of law. It suited her. The things she saw, however, and the things she'd given up, often left her wondering, was it all worth it? Inside of her own head, as always, Delvina thought just, why, if only just for one day, shouldn't I be excited by something? Nothing ever seems to happen to me. I'm told that this phone should entertain me, yet here I am, unfazed. Oh, why was I not born to be like the other girls? Boring. A vacuum. I would enjoy life much more if I were a vapid lady. Or at least a lady with a man to yield my resolve to. Then, I could let my guard down. She took a sip of her vino and gazed off at the red bricks that made up the hotel opposite her, until something piqued her interest. A shadow. It were only visible for a moment, but Delvina was a perceptive young woman. Perhaps a little too perceptive. She had the type of awareness that would ruin a social setting for her. Every nonchalant glance or unspoken word she could feel. The world had far too much to look at. It was not her fault. But this shadow had presented a familiar canvas for her thoughts that evening. A memory of her past. She lifted her pastel blue Goyard handbag from the floor, leaving a £50 note between the money clip that had been given to her by her father only earlier that day, and she set off into the looking glass. There were people of all backgrounds around St. James's tonight. It was Thursday, and any well-to-do member of society would be out. The transition that had occurred from office-based work to sat at their computer at home allowed for this, and Delvina would quite often allow her ear to be opened by conversation within her vicinity. Gentlemen in suits from St. Germain Street, broker and deals at the table with a face full of caviar and Grand Cru. This had been the greatest adaptation to come from technology, she had thought to herself. Then, pulling yet another cigarette from the box and lighting it with an old Zippo she had found in an antique shop engraved with the initials JP, Delvina found solace by the entrance to the hotel. It was the 22, in a very fine establishment. Upon completing her bar examination years ago, she'd stayed there with her first lover at the age of 22. They'd met whilst in university together, and for some strange reason, he began to appear in her mind that very night. Upon being seated, she checked her phone. Delvina realised it had been around 9 years to the date. Memories rarely excited her, but this one, it always left an unfinished feeling. It's said that you only ever love one person, and often, Delvina had wondered if this guy had been her one. Where was he now? Well, she could never know. He'd always had the propensity to inspire delusions. He would disappear for days, weeks, sometimes even months. Delvina hated this, but deep down, his mystery would be the intrigue that she had never felt before. In her head, every idea would play out before bed, but then he'd reappear with stories she could never have imagined. This man had been perhaps the only to ever excite her. The very nature of his mystery was the spark. There had only been a few gentlemen in her circle, but most could be pinpointed on a map to her. Delvina in fact found most men to be far too predictable in her eyes, and what she loved about this man was the uncertainty, Romance is nothing without it, he would always say. He would always quote Oscar Wilde an insufferable amount of times a day. But deep down, as she lay on the pillow, before closing her eyes to go to sleep, she would smile and think of this. And she still does. He was from humble beginnings, but had an insatiable curiosity for knowledge, something that she'd always admired. In fact, he'd gifted her a book, and upon receiving it back from her, before the day he left, he'd found notes of love inside. One of which read, "This was the first book he gave me. I love that he reads. It is so admirable." Dated the 17th of November, she knew that if he were anywhere, he'd have climbed right to the very top. Up the ladder he would go. She remembered their first encounter. There was something endearing about the way he would avert his eyes when she had entered the class hall. For but 3 lessons they spoke not a word to each other, only longing glances sent into the ether with a note attached that read, "I want to know you." They both felt this. Everybody around them did. He'd always appreciated her boisterous ways, her way with words. "A woman with a bite," he would say, "is electrifying until you realise you're in too deep." And bite she would. Her words her daggers, and the glares, they told you exactly what you wanted to hear, even if you feared it. Work, emails, is this what she gave it all up for? All she could think of were his shoes, his smug attitude upon sharing something controversial, his staunch nature, and his fearlessness in going against the grain, his unkempt hair accompanied by his tidy words. He made no sense to her, unlike the other men. As mentioned, there were few surprises to be had whilst out with the cattle of London. Beyond the physical, there seemed to be very little humanity left. Perhaps she'd been spoiled in her earlier years. Perhaps that's why she found very little enjoyment in the parlours that she so commonly frequents. They had always spoken of living on a boat and hopping the islands of Greece together. There would be wines, cheeses, and he'd fall asleep on her lap, with the sun slightly bleeding through the canopy. She'd mark the page he'd fallen asleep whilst reading, and she'd rub his head. Dozing off, she'd hear whimpers, as if he were a cat, and unbeknownst to him, she'd take photos, the existence of his sleeping gallery existing only in her mind. She'd look at them, longing for him whenever he disappeared again, and a fair share of kisses, of which he would smother her every crevice. Often, he'd refer to Delvina as his little lampshade. That was because, when he was with her, he believed all the harshness of the world to be blocked out. He'd lie with his hand on her derriere, stealing a small look every few minutes just to keep him full of love. Where was he, Delvina wondered, and she continued to do so every day.